In this lecture and the next ones, we're going to talk a little bit more about events. Now, we already worked with events before, of course, but now let's add some more important concepts and also make things a bit more clear. So, an event is basically a signal that is generated by a certain DOM node. And a signal means that something has happened. For example, a click somewhere, or the mouse moving, or the user triggering the full screen mode, and really anything of importance that happens on our web page generates an event. And as we already know, we can then listen for these events in our code using event listeners, so that we can then handle them if we'd like. But no matter if we handle a certain event or not, for example a click, that event will always happen when a user clicks. So it doesn't matter if we're actually listening for it or not. All right? And that's going to be important to understand also in the next video. Now, we already worked with a couple of different events earlier in the course, but now let's take a look at another type of events, which is the mouse enter event. But let's start by selecting an element, and let's use the h1 element this time. So we have an h1, which is this here, and so let's just say document.querySelector h1, and now we can listen for that event. So we already know about this one, so add event listener, but in this video we're going to take a look at two more ways of listening for events. All right, but anyway, let's now use mouse enter as I said previously. So mouse enter, and then as always a function with an event. So the mouse enter event here is a little bit like the hover event in CSS. So it fires whenever a mouse enters a certain element. So just as the name says. So whenever that happens, let's create an alert which says add event listener, just so we know where this one is coming from. Great. You are reading the heading. Okay. And let's try it out now. And indeed, as we hovered over it, we got this alert. And if we do it again, it comes again. So that works just fine. Let's now actually take a look at a list of different events on MDN. Let's say JavaScript events. And yeah, this is what I was looking for. So this event reference. So let's take a look at some of the more important ones. So we see that we already used the click events. So where are they? So here, mouse events. So click, this is the one we have been using all the time. But this time we used mouse enter. And as you see, there's then also mouse leave, which is fired off when the mouse is moved off the element. And then you have all of these. And of course, you can take a look at this list here by yourself. And you see that there is all these different kinds of events that we can eventually learn how to respond to. But usually the most important ones are the ones related to mouse and the keyboard ones. Okay? But for example, there are also some for the clipboard and for full screen and for resizing the page and for when we scroll the page and so on and so forth. Okay? So here is the warning again. But anyway, let me now show you another way of attaching an event listener to an element. And that is by using the so-called onEvent property directly on the element. So for example, when we want to listen for mouse enter, there is a property called on mouse enter. And then we can simply set that property to this function. All right. So here, let's do that. Just to see. And so now we get, of course, the alert from before, but we should get a second alert as well. And indeed, here it is. Okay. And so actually for each of the events that we just saw in the table, there is one on-event property like this one. For example, also on click. All right. However, this way of listening to events is a bit old school. So it used to be done like this in the old days, but now we usually always use add event listener. Okay. So I'm just showing you this in case you ever come across this way of listening for events. Now there are two ways why add event listener is better. And the first one is that it allows us to add multiple event listeners to the same event. So we could do this here again and simply change the function here. But if we did the same with this property, then the second function would basically simply override the first one. All right. So that's one advantage of add event listener. And the second one, even more important, is that we can actually remove an event handler in case we don't need it anymore. And this is something that we hadn't done before, but it's actually very simple and very useful from time to time. And to do that, first we need to export the function into a named function. So we cannot just write, for example, the same function and expect it to work. That's not going to work. So let's take this here out. And let's say alert h1 is this function. And then on h1, here I want to pass in that. Let's just comment out this one so it doesn't get in our way. And so let's see. And indeed, it still works. That was not on purpose, but we can now actually prevent that from happening. So after we listened for an event and then handled that event here in this function, we can then remove that event listener. So here we can say h1 and now remove event listener. And again, we have to say mouse enter and then the name of the function. And so this is why we had to export the function into its own function. All right. And so let's see. So indeed, we got this alert now. But if I now hover this again, then nothing happens. And that's because in the same event handler function, we also then removed the event listener. And so this makes it that we can only listen for the event once. So this is a nice pattern whenever you only want to listen to any event just once. But of course, this doesn't have to be in here. So you can remove the event listener at any place in our code. For example, we could remove it after a certain time has passed. So let's use setTimeout here and a simple arrow function. And let's say that after 3 seconds have passed, we want to remove the event listener. So now we get it. And right now, apparently 3 seconds have already passed. And so now it's gone. All right. So this is another pattern of removing the event listener. But of course, there are going to be other situations where this is helpful. Finally, there's also a third way of handling events, which is by using an HTML attribute. Now, this one should actually not be used, but just for the sake of curiosity, I'm going to show it to you here. So let's actually this time use the onClick, just so we have a different one. But so this is quite similar to what we did here before in the JavaScript with the on mouse enter. We're simply defining it directly in HTML. Then here we basically specify a string and then we say what we want to happen. So this is pretty weird, but well, this is kind of old school JavaScript from the early days. Alert. Okay. And so now when we click here, then we get HTML alert. All right. But anyway, we don't need to bother with this one, but I'm just going to leave it here for you as a reference. And so that's different ways of handling events and also how to remove event listeners in case we don't need them anymore. Next up, you will learn about the most important property of events, which is bubbling. So let's move on right to the next video.